Hi, everyone. Happy Friday, and welcome to the Data Viz Direct Meetup number 27. So our first-time guests, I'm Christina. I'm co-organizer at the Data Visualization Zurich Meetup. So Data Viz Zurich Meetup is an open nonprofit community for everyone interested in data visualization. And we usually try to cover a wide range of topics, ranging from best practices, case studies, tools, and techniques. Today's guest is Erica Gunn. So welcome, Erica, and thank you so much for joining us. And she will be talking to us about putting charts in context and designing visualization ecosystems for our data. So just a little bit about Erica. Erica is a data visualization designer at one of the largest clinical trial data companies in the world. She creates information ecosystems that helps clients understand their data better and to access it in more intuitive and better ways. Erica is also serving currently as the Director of Education for the Data Visualization Society, and previously she was a research scientist and college chemistry professor. So welcome, Erica, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I will hand it over to Erica. So in the meantime, for any questions, please feel free to leave them under the Q&A and Erica will address them at the end. So thank you everyone, and Erica, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Christina, and thank you for the invitation. It's exciting to be here and talk to you all. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk a little bit about how we design charts for advanced use cases and really how we put charts in context. And I like to talk about that in terms of visualization ecosystems for the data. Before we get into that, I'd like to give you a little bit of information on my context. I design interfaces that help people engage with layered and interrelated data, lots of different pieces coming together in one piece of software. As Christina mentioned, my company creates software for administering clinical trials. So there's a lot of different pieces to that data that we need to pull together and assemble to get a full picture of what's going on in that space. And we're essentially, at the end of the day, trying to help our users to make good decisions. So the work that I'm working on right now is focused on supporting a team of expert users in planning their trials. They get in and are doing some really sophisticated tasks with the data to understand what's happened in the past, what might happen in the future, what they need in order to make their trial successful. In order to do that, they're pulling in data from multiple databases, different kinds of dimensions, lots of different metrics. And they're doing this in a very short period of time. So they usually have 4 to 10 days to plan, but then they will be engaging with that study over 1 to 12 years. Is not unusual for a clinical trial to go very, very long. So it's really important for us to help them to make good decisions quickly, to give them enough information to set up that strategy because trials are very expensive to run. And then once it is running, to give them the opportunity to assess the progress against the targets that they've set and evaluate whether or not they're on track. And if they're not on track, to do something about it very quickly before it becomes a cost problem or jeopardizes the success of the trial. So today, I'd like to talk about a few different pieces of this. First, we'll talk a little bit about what that visualization ecosystem means in my sort of world and context. Then we'll get into a few different motifs and patterns that you see for how we structure software to think about how we can design interfaces that support these more complex kinds of tasks. And then I'll walk through some just general principles of charts and a use case for a chart that we're actually currently working on to put into the context of the app and some of the decisions that go into that. So first, starting with visualization ecosystems, I think it's important as designers and just people working with data to recognize that interfaces are really just collections of tasks strung together in different ways, and we're there to support the user in figuring out what they need to know from the data. And so if we take that context that I was talking about and we break it out, for each of those individual pieces, we can identify tasks that those people might be doing that are related to their particular context. So if we're talking about a team, there's going to be some kind of collaboration and handoff. This often is internal and external, where they're also giving things to clients, which becomes important in a lot of our conversations. They're performing pretty complicated tasks. They're doing lots of different things. So that probably means that we have pretty big workflows, and those may need to be divided into subtasks, routines, additional smaller things in order to make that effective and efficient. We're working on multidimensional data, which means it may have many different layers that need to be brought together. And providing users information about the context, how it's been aggregated, what it means, what the end values are, how all of those pieces come together is important for helping them to actually make meaningful comparisons within the data. So that's always first and foremost in my mind as we're working through this, is how do we present this data in a way that the user understands what it means. Again, we mentioned that they're working over long periods of time, which means they may need to iterate, compare what's going on with what they thought would be going on, and adjust. Making good decisions will be a matter of looking at what's really happening, getting into the details, maybe drilling down, setting strategies.
Erica, sorry, just 1 second. I think we're having issues with seeing your current slide. Which slide are you on right now?
Collections of tasks.
Yeah, we're still seeing your general PowerPoint, like the whole PowerPoint app. Can you try like switching off and on again the screen sharing, maybe?
Yes, let me stop share.
Yeah, maybe you're only sharing the app window.
I wonder if it's when I go into presentation mode that it's stopping. Can you see now? Interfaces says collections of tasks.
No, I still see your PowerPoint app. Maybe when you're sharing, it's only sharing the. Okay, yeah, there you go. Now we can see it. All
now
right.
you can see what?
I can see interfaces are collections of tasks.
Okay, so you're still seeing the PowerPoint. That's going to be hard with my animations. Well, we'll just go with this as it is. That's okay.
Right.
Okay, so we have interfaces, collections of tasks. Let me just pop back. No, there's not that much that we're missing there. So the slides are also available on my website and they will be coming out after. So for what you missed there, apologies. And
somebody is suggesting if you can reshare. Sorry, somebody is suggesting if you can reshare your screen and then switch to like choose which window is being shared, and then maybe you can share the actual presentation. So
I was sharing the PowerPoint. Oh,
does
I think
allow you to choose a window, or
hold on just a second. I think I know what you mean. Let's see.
sometimes it's only, yeah.
Share. So that's my PowerPoint.
Can you share the whole screen? Does it allow you to choose that?
Yeah, let's do that and see. So we made the mistake when we were prepping for this of saying that we didn't have any tech difficulties. That's why. Now, can you see the whole thing?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. All right.
And none of the PowerPoint mess around the edges.
All right, so good now.
Okay. All right, so let's just continue on from here. But basically, again, thank you for letting me know that that was happening. Sorry, it took a couple slides for us to get there. So interfaces are collections of tasks. We can think about all the different things that a user needs to do in those cases. And a visualization ecosystem is basically, in my mind, just the collection of all the data, displays, and controls that structure and support a particular task for a particular user. And very often, as a visualization designer, you're going to be asked to work down here on the individual chart, pick the chart type, maybe put some annotations in there, think about some interactions, tell us which chart colors are best, right? You're going to be asked to do some fairly isolated things, but I really think that this actually works across the whole spectrum of the product context. You might also be asked to look at UI design. Can you contribute to our style guide? Can you tell us which charts to choose? Can you synchronize with our brand colors and think about the hierarchy of the app, right? So those are usually the sort of traditional domain of data viz and data viz design, I would say, in a company context and a product context. But really, we do need to work across this whole space to do our job well, especially for these more complex interfaces. So, you know, there's all kinds of questions about the business context and the priorities, what we're trying to do. There are legal and privacy limitations when we're dealing with health data. We need to be able to protect the privacy of both our patients and our clients at all times. Thinking about what the user really needs to do and what persona are that are engaging with the app. The application architecture itself, the structure of the pages, the way they're grouped, the different kinds of controls and how those affect what's visible in the application at different times. In our apps, we have lots of different filters and other advanced controls, and then some data sources and additional things like that. So really, we need to think about across this entire ecosystem to make the chart itself successful. So we often work within the microscope setting, but then we need to zoom out and see the whole picture. Again, just next to walk through some different patterns for how we structure workflow, because that's going to influence what the user's trying to see and how we present the data to them. And architecture is really the structure and the scaffold that everything else rests on. So it's the grouping and sequence of tasks. It moves the user from one point to another. And if you're following a workflow well, you should have a sense of specifically what that person needs at that point in time for that person and for that task. So it always depends on who you're working for. Very simple architecture. Probably the most common one still is the hierarchy, the tree of file trees. Arbitrary system. You can move into it, you can drill in, you can drill out, and you can move things between, but you have to understand that whole system in order to be able to navigate it well. Another motif is a search. So you put that on top of a hierarchy, and now you pull up the information that you need. It makes it a lot easier if you don't happen to know that entire arbitrary system from scratch. And they're often paired in an interface. So there's the hierarchy here and the search right above it. And then you have the space where you're looking at objects on the screen that you can then pull into a collection and see an overview and a summary of what you're building as you go. And then, of course, you can take additional actions on this, such as deciding to place your purchase. A wizard is another structure. These are very good when you are doing validation or something where you don't want anybody to miss a step, or if you're trying to simplify something that's complex. So breaking it down and having it go stepwise can also feel really, really long, and users tend to get impatient with them. It's interesting in this one. When you come into Amazon and you sign in, it actually jumps you from the first step to the last step of the wizard to prove to you how efficient it is. It's moved you through the whole process and then gives you a summary at the end. So wizards can be good, again, for things like validation, where you really do need to go stepwise, but they can also feel really confining. So you want to use them in limited amounts and only when necessary. The one that is closest to the work that I do is a command center. And the characteristics of a command center are that you have a big open space for whatever that primary task is, whatever you care most about. And that open space is the priority. Everything else goes around the edges. You can see there are commands on or controls on all 4 edges here, and they are actually multiple layers deep. You can also configure those and change them based on your preferences and needs. And here, the advantage is power. You have everything you want at your fingertips. It is right there. You can get into it. And the disadvantage is that it's very hard to learn and can be overwhelming for a new user. A lot of our applications do lean toward the command center sort of approach. And then we hear from novice users that they don't even know where to start. So for an example, in Illustrator, this is Adobe Illustrator for those of you who may not have seen it before. There are lots of different menus here. I can click over here on the side to get into a tab and then click on the more details to get into my hierarchy and then drill down from here to here to here to there if I want to add a particular pattern to my chart. And that's fine as long as you know where to find it. But it can be very hard to figure it out. I've been using Adobe for 7-8 years now, and I still find things all the time that I didn't even know it could do. And usually when I do, it's exactly what I want. And that's a really key characteristic of a command center sort of approach. And it doesn't matter what's in the middle. It could be a table, it could be a mechanical engineering drawing, it could be a chart, it could be really anything. But it's that paradigm of optimize the workspace, put everything on the side, but still give me control over everything. Hard to learn, very powerful if only you knew how to do it, right? We can also think about platforms. As tasks get more and more complex, you might have several tasks that require a isolated command center sort of workspace in a row that need to be done differently, but they have different things that need to happen. So Adobe has a platform. You can work in Photoshop with pixels, Illustrator with vectors, InDesign with layout, print, typography, and you can move between those. So this works well if you have one person who's working on a very isolated task and then it just needs to move down the chain. Or if you have tasks that can be sort of split up into groups. Also, characteristic of a platform is that there's some way of integrating from one step to the other. So if I do something in Photoshop and make an edit, if I've set my InDesign file up correctly, it will actually link back to my file tree. And when I save from Photoshop, it will re-import into InDesign and I don't need to replace that image. So there's no user rework there because the platform takes care of it. So we can isolate those really complicated tasks, optimize the controls for the individual ones. Illustrator type controls are very different and much simpler than the InDesign type controls where you really care about the typography and the details more. So you can play with those different things and customize for each individual persona if you can sort of isolate into packages what they're trying to do. We do work on a platform, and so that's an important thing for us. And it's also important to realize that the structure, the way you draw that is not as important as what it can do. So Mural, Figma, and Illustrator all use the same sort of an interface structure. They have that big central workspace and some kind of controls on the side. In Mural, you get to pick your Post-it note color and its shape. You can put some text in it, but you can't even make the heading bold without making the body bold too. So very restricted. Figma is optimized for sharing in teams, simpler drawings, but vector-based. And then you can easily send those back and forth and create systems for maintaining the structures within a product or a company or a team. Illustrator gives you full control over everything in that vector. If you really want to get in there and optimize and do really specialized stuff, that's probably the tool. So the tool that you use and the kind of thing that you're trying to do in it also determine what it needs to do. Lots of different ways we can think about metaphors for hierarchy workflow, what a user is trying to do. They might be trying to zoom in, or they might be trying to zoom out. They might be trying to make a collection of different things that they can compare over time. They might be doing all of these things together. As I mentioned before, we might be adding layers of information or changing perspectives as someone moves through different parts of the project. And ultimately, in most expert software, you're really going to be wanting to do all of these at different times and then synthesizing a picture. So you make a collection of seashells, you take observations of the individual, you think about the species, you think about what that means for evolution, and all of a sudden you have a picture of life, right? So you're kind of doing all of these things together and then moving at different levels of abstraction, depending on what you're trying to do. And so it's all about finding balance, right? There are lots of different things that we can control and we can modify in different ways depending on what we think our user wants. Our application is fairly simple. Right now, we really have two main pages and then tabs within them. The interface itself is fairly straightforward. Lots of direct actions because our users are in a hurry. They don't want to do lots of clicks, even if it makes things seem simpler. They will do more complex configuration if it keeps them in the same place. We need it to be powerful and we need it to be fast. So you can think about sort of where your application or your context falls in here, and that's going to influence your choices. In some cases, as in ours, one of the reasons that I'm thinking about these different kinds of architecture right now is that we are trying to think about how to fuse two different workflows together. So we have some users who are novice users, their first time in the software, or people who engage with it maybe once a year. Again, on a 10-year trial, you might not be coming in all the time. So those people are going to have a very different experience than our experts who are in here every day and really need to get stuff out. For the novice user, you probably want some kind of a guided workflow. You know, they set up a project, we talk them through how to set it up, we give some recommendations, have a summary to structure information, and then we get them into the complicated things when they know what the context is. Our experts want nothing to do with that. They want us to give them the data table and get out of the way, right? Get in, here's the Explorer, give me the controls, let me do what I want, and then I will take this out to my Power BI or whatever I'm going to use, and I will take care of the rest. So for them, we really want to get into that Data Explorer page at the beginning. They might care about a summary. They might still want to see that, print it out, send it to a client, whatever, but it's much less important to them. And so we're currently thinking about how to stitch these different pieces together to support those different persona in doing their tasks. So there's lots of different ways that we can do that. You can have an Explorer focused way. And here I'm drawing this as a page just to kind of make them comparable. Really, there's no difference between a large space where you're working in more of a command center with tabs versus a long page that's dividing it up. So just a different way of drawing it here. But let's say you come in, you do a task, you save it off, and that becomes part of your project. You come in, you do a complicated task, you save it off, and then at the end, you can see a summary of everything, right? That's one way, focusing on the Explorer first. Or we can look at a project. You come in and you look at the first piece, and it lets you do some more details with the tasks. You go on to the second, it opens up another modal, gives you some more access to details for that particular task, and walks you through in steps. You can try doing both at the same time. Instead of going to a separate space, you can embed it in the page. So here's my first section, and here are the main things that I need to do, and I can go over here for some advanced settings. Or you can think about having parallel paths where you can go the Explorer route, or you can go the project route, and then you interface between them with some kind of connecting modules that allow that functionality to bridge the two situations. So we haven't solved this problem yet. We're not sure exactly how we're going to get there and what we're going to do, but it's a really big question, is how do we support these different users and these different tasks with these different perspectives at the same time in the same place. So that's about the application. Next, I want to start coming back to those charts because I know that's what we care most about. It's the things that are most interesting. And I think it's important to think about what someone needs to do in order to read a chart, especially for a novice user, to really understand what those different stages are in the process. And then also we'll get into a case study in chart design, and you can see how we're applying some of those things. So when you first look at a chart, your brain sees a big blob. Maybe it sees that that blob sort of trends downhill. It starts to resolve the fact that there is a squiggle in that blob. And then at that point, you might recognize that it's a chart. That's your pre-attentive processing, or your pre-attentive processing. So you're coming in, you're really just seeing the object for the first time, and your brain needs to go through a set of things in order to resolve it. It's very fast, so that it happens as quickly as you look at things, but it's also very easily fooled. So it's one that you have to be careful with pre-attentive processing because it can lead to misperceptions very easily. Get through that. Next, you want to get into the user actually saying, oh, that's a chart. I wonder what that point means. That's engagement, where we have decided now to start paying more attention, and we switch over into attentive processing. Much slower, takes more effort, maybe takes more expertise. It may not feel as rewarding as just glancing and knowing. And we hear this a lot in the feedback that we get from different persona. So we hear about people who are busy, who are looking at a report, they want things to just jump off the page at them. They don't want to have to read it. They just want to see what matters. That's someone that's speaking to pre-attentive processing. The things that we can do to support that is using familiar encodings, keeping structures similar so that you use the same color in a series from one page to the next. Maybe the chart shows up in the same place on the page in every page of the report so that that person knows where to look and they know what they're getting. And they can easily see if it has changed. We can think about Gestalt principles for grouping things together to really speak to that pre-attentive processing and how our brain encodes and processes the world. And we can increase salience by making it big, making it bold, making it bright, doing something to draw attention to this thing right here. That's the one that's important. That all of those things help that user. The other end of the spectrum is the one that I live in most of the time, where we're working with someone who is deep in the data and they want it to be useful. They might not care what it looks like, but they want it to be useful. That person is going to take the time. They're going to get into those details. They care about having an appropriate chart that helps them make careful and accurate conclusions and comparisons. And any design decisions that we make have to support that task. And it's important to realize that the choices that we make with the salience for the first persona can sometimes actually harm or hurt or interfere with the task for the second persona. So if I make something big, bold, and bright, and it happens to be not the pattern you're looking for in the chart, you're looking for other more flexible comparisons, it can actually get in the way of you seeing what you're looking for. So a lot of times, the more technical user won't have as much patience for Flash as the less technical user will. And the way we move between those is user engagement, right? How important do they think this information is? Are they interested? Do they think it's actually going to be relevant to them? For the pre-attentive processing, there may also be an element of, is it aesthetically appealing? Does it feel approachable? Do I think I can understand this, or do I think it's going to overwhelm me? So there's a lot for design to do in there to support those different people. We have to do a lot of different things in order to read a chart. Those of us who do this all the time tend to forget, but there's an external identification of context, recognizing that it is an encoding in the first place and then which one it is and what that means. thinking about how to query those individual details and knowing how to extract the internal identification information out of the chart so that you know what those details mean, to read a value off of an axis, etc. And then ultimately synthesizing and understanding so that you see what's inside the chart. And if we don't get our user there, we haven't done our job, right? It hasn't actually been an effective chart. So everything that we do in our world is trying to get to the user to that point where they understand and they can synthesize the information in that chart. And every chart has a structure. Those structures are built to support that, giving that external context, telling them what it's about, creating context, supporting lookup so that the user can read the values and understand what they mean, having titles and labels that give the definition for those encodings, again, helping them understand what it means. The marks themselves are intended and optimized to support the comparison within the chart. And then annotations can direct attention, again, increasing the salience of that one point you want them to see. So here's a chart. This is one that we've been working on for about 3 months pretty intensively, believe it or not. It looks simple and harmless enough, but there's a lot in there when you start thinking about all the different data use cases. So in this particular case, we have some users coming in to use our tool, and they are planning a clinical trial, and they want to set some targets and see later how their study is doing, whether it's going well or not going well. So this initial chart is just their plan. They've come in, they've made a plan. We have some sense of, how likely it is to actually hit the target that they've set, and there's some variation around it. At this stage, the only control we have to give them is whether or not they see the variation. In general, that's not a particularly necessary control, but it's one that we can provide. At this stage, it's not necessary. You'll see later why it might become necessary. One thing that we can do to help the user to understand the context in this chart is to tell them when the last data came in and when your project is supposed to end, right? A couple of milestones now frame the information in this chart and tell you, oh, I'm actually going to hit my target way before the project ends. I'm actually in really good shape according to my plan. We can actually add some points to emphasize that, right? What I'm doing there is looking at where this curve intersects the latest data line and the project line. A user might not know to do that, so I can put some points on it to make it more obvious. And if you were going to read this chart, as I have it here, the next step would be to say, okay, well, what's the value at project end? What's the value at latest date? Subtract those two, and now I know how much I need to do to get this done. So I can support that by putting some extra labels on the axis so that you don't have to guesstimate what those values are. Then you can do the subtraction in your head. And it's this one of those cases where great plans and reality sometimes don't match. So based on what I just described, that's the analytical case of an expert user coming in to read a chart. I would expect that it would be useful for someone to see the value 21 on the chart. But when we tested this with users, internal, external, and users, product and project people, engineers, a lot of them were asking, about 50% were asking, what is that purple 21 for? What does that mean? What do you do with that number? And I'm surprised that they asked, and I'd kind of explain, but they still didn't see why it mattered, and they didn't think it was important. So it's just an interesting insight into how the way we think about our charts and the way our users use our charts may sometimes be very different things. And I suspect that this happens because most people are used to using charts in a digital context, where you don't actually need to use the axis anymore. You just hover over it and it gives you the value. You get a tooltip instead. So I think there's a little bit less use of an axis than I might have predicted as someone who has, sort of grown up using charts in a sense. So that's one that we're probably not going to implement in the first rev. We might put it back in again later. As we move forward, it may become relevant, and it'll be interesting to see how it goes. Another consideration for this particular chart is that most of the time, one of the core use cases at this stage of the process is for this user to be collaborating with other people and wanting to share these results and the different plans and projections. So most often they're just taking a screenshot of the app, sticking that in a PowerPoint presentation and going off and talking about it. So one thing that we're trying to do here is to really support them in being able to get the information that they need without that interaction. So having that label may become important, or it may not. We'll see what happens. Another thing we need to do is to add in more milestones because these are long projects. They very often have many, many different milestones within the course of the project that people might be trying to hit. So we want to show as many as they need, but no more because it gets cluttered. One thing that I'm doing here to help make this a little bit clearer, it's busy, but to make it clearer, is that the latest data line is bold and black, very salient. The project end is bold, a little less salient, but still strong. And then all the others are gray. If I take that out, you can see that it's actually a lot harder to find the latest and the project end. It just pushes them back to the same level as everybody else, and you don't see that hierarchy anymore. You can still identify because the point is there, but it just gets a little harder to read. If I take all of the visual hierarchy out of the chart, now you can see that there's a lot of noise. I think about this one as the chart behind bars. You see all those black lines aligned on top of it. Gestalt principles say that when you have a bunch of things that are very similar, styled similarly, you'll tend to perceive them together. And so the chart, you kind of see a series of bars in front of the chart, not milestone labels that are behind and less important than the chart. So just important to control that visual hierarchy to just give subtle cues about what it is that people should be seeing. We can also, if we want to add some more interaction, get a little fancier, take some of those milestone markers out, show the ones that are important by default, and then let people control what they want to see. So we can take complexity out of the chart and put it into the interface and then give the user control so that they can adjust the things that they need when they actually need them. I mentioned that this chart gets a little bit crazier and more complex. This is a little closer to the actual thing. So what's happening here is we have your plan. The green line is what you're actually doing right now, your current progress and where you are. So of course you want to compare that versus where you thought you'd be. And then you have a new plan going forward from there based on where you are today. And that may win over the original or it may not. We'd like to see at the end of the project, am I still going to hit my target with my new plan? Another piece that we've not yet put in, but we have considered is that most of our clients have contractual obligations attached to these plans. So once they've come up with their plan in their first 10 days, they are now obligated to deliver on it. And that contract may or may not be negotiated to be a little bit more conservative than the plan was. I've made it a lot more conservative here, but it may be more or less conservative. So it's also useful to see what you've actually promised that you will do and where you might have obligations that you'll pay for if you don't hit. So there's lots of different comparisons that we can do in here. And one of the things as we add more series in that happens is that now we have milestone markers for each series. So each milestone we now have 3 of each milestone. And there are 3 different pieces of information in the milestone labels. So we want to put in the series name so that you know which one it pertains to, the milestone itself, the information about what that thing is labeling, and the date at which you're hitting it. And that gets a little crazy. So one thing we tried, which very clearly failed, but one thing that we tried was to remove the series name and instead link the milestone to the series using color. So the things related to the pink or purple series are in pink or purple. The things related to the green series are in green. The things related to the black series are in black. And you can see that that creates all kinds of chaos and confusion between those things because some things are grouped by color in one way and other things are grouped a different way. So sometimes you just got to try it to find out if it works. And in this case, it did not. So we had to deal with the fact that we're going to have really long labels, truncation, overlap, all of those things in a different way. But it's always worth a try. But this is really a matter of grouping and salience, battling it out in the chart and just causing a mess. Another thing that we often hear, even with all of these things to support understanding in the chart, is that users are just overwhelmed. They're not that familiar with charts. They don't know where to start. And they're not quite sure what the chart means. So one way that we can deal with that, again, coming back to that preference for a tooltip to help, is to give them a little summary of what they're supposed to be able to see. So here's your chart, here's the date, here's where you are, here's where you need to get to and where you thought you'd be, and here's the difference between those things, kind of doing all of the subtasks for the user so that then they can read it out of the tooltip instead of having to do those visual comparisons themselves. If we want to simplify that, because we've also heard that that is a big tooltip and it is overwhelming in and of itself, we can take a more focused approach as long as we can pick a particular target that we want to compare against. So if we only ever want to compare against our goal, then when we hover, we can see the difference between the thing we hovered over and the goal, and we can calculate the difference for them, and they can see the values that they would want to see. In that case, because we have just one comparison, we can also draw it on the chart so that we're emphasizing where in the chart they should be looking, and hopefully they're learning to be able to do these things sort of on their own as they read the chart and become more comfortable. We can do this for different points at different times. So we can maybe give them a choice, again, taking complexity out of the chart, putting it into the interface, giving them the option of picking what they want to compare to, assuming that that's going to change at different times. Because it's perfectly valid to want to compare against your goal to see how much more you have to do before the end, to compare against your contract to see how much trouble you're in, and to compare against your new plan to see if you're really going to make it. So there are different things that they need to do at different times, and we can support them in that. Same game. We have something that's complicated in the chart. Let's move it out of the chart into the interface. We can take that tooltip and make it a table instead. Move those controls up top so that they're not in the way. Maybe make them collapsible so that you can hide them and get rid of some of that noise in the interface when you're done. And then you have a simple hover interaction over here. When you hover, it gives you that same set of information in a structured format, and it highlights the one that you've told it is important to you. So that's one way of doing this. Every time you make a change like this, you also open up new possibilities for advanced things. So in the tooltip, you probably don't want to keep adding things in, but in this table, you could add another column and allow someone to click in one spot on the x-axis and then click on a second or hover on a second, and then do a side-by-side comparison of two particular dates. So we don't need that use case right now. We won't even be developing this one for the moment. But it's useful to think about what someone might get into and how you can expand the different things in the future to see where they could go. Because with an expert user, there will always be more comparisons that they need to make, and there will always be more tasks that they need to do. The other piece, so far I've talked about just one chart, but there are actually two. These two are coupled together. The top one is important early in the project, and the bottom one is important later in the project. And they show the same time scale, the project time scale, and very similar information. We're changing the top one to use the line chart like the bottom one does right now, so that they'll even be the same kind of visual form, but they show different pieces of information. So when we have two things next to each other, there's always a question, do we combine them? If I have a slider on my top chart, should it be linked to the slider on the bottom chart so that my time series is always aligned and I can zoom in and zoom out on the charts together? In our case, that doesn't work because most of the details on the top chart happen early and you still want to see where you're going to get to at the end. So we decided not to link those and to keep them independent. But the same thing or the same question comes up for all of these other controls as well. Do they belong at the chart level, or should we be looking at them at the page section level? And then at the page section, we do already have one control. This one controls the aggregation level for the data in the chart. So you can start out at the study, or you could maybe drill down and look at a particular country, and you can move back and forth between those. When you do that, that is happening at the section level and across both charts at the same time. So we have some controls that apply to a chart, and we have some controls that apply to a section. Also, because we're comparing two charts, that collapse function becomes a lot more important. You want to be able to get that out of the way so that the user can just see those two charts next to each other, because that is the core task. They want to be able to take a screenshot of the whole thing. But you can see with this sort of a tooltip table approach, you could actually take a screenshot of that whole thing and then have a picture of what's going on in both charts pretty easily. That's not where it ends for our application. We keep going, not on this particular page, but on most of them. You can actually go up another level and have filters and additional application controls that completely set the data context for your charts. Your charts may come back not populated. They may come back with NAs. They may come back with all kinds of different things, depending on what your filter settings are. So we also need to be able to think about, respond to, and accommodate all of those different pieces. So lots of different interesting things in here to think about. And again, the chart is the most complex representation, but it is only a reflection of the application's data state. And that varies by customer. It varies based on the filter controls. It varies based on time, what's available in the study. And so all of these different things need to work together to make sure that the chart does its job all the time. That's why it's taken us 3 months to make a line chart. You know, that's kind of how it goes. So when you're working on something like this, there's a lot of questions to ask. And again, the slide deck will be out, so you can always look through these more on your own. But I think the most important one is, do we really need this? When we're talking to these expert users and they're asking us for all of these crazy advanced features, it's like, how often do you really need that one? Is it that important? Do we really need to show that? What do you need it for? What are you trying to see? What are you trying to do? And then we create the structures that help to simplify and again, take that complexity out of the chart, put it into the interface that can handle it better. We're always trying to set smart defaults so that the user can choose what they actually need at a particular time. And in general, it is always best to keep the chart simpler because, again, partly people are intimidated by the chart to begin with. And so a whole lot of complex controls and interactions within it can be hard for them to learn and hard for them to understand. But also it's just very difficult to program and to keep up. So interface controls tend to be easier to maintain for our engineering teams. And the chart stuff is a lot harder to specialize and make work for all of these different conditions. So we're always trying to move those things into the interface and let the interface support and drive, and let the chart be really as stupid as possible. It should do as little as it can in order to get the job done, and then as simply as it can. But also accomplishing whatever it is that the user persona needs and different user persona might need. Chart display for us is not the same for all clients. It can be wildly different. Some will have only one series, some will have all of them, some will have half of them, some will have only one of the two charts, not both. So that's part of the complexity that we need to think through, is how all of those different controls change at that point. And we need to think how it's going to adapt and change over time, so that if we develop it today, we won't find out in 3 months that we need to develop it again in a different way. So just a few parting thoughts here. When we're looking at things from this broader ecosystem perspective, it's important to realize that the right chart is not always a fancy one. And it completely depends on what the user is trying to do, the context that it's in, and the specific tasks that you're trying to create. When we first made this chart, the first chart in that series, it was actually a bar chart because it didn't really matter. It was a coin flip one way or the other on the two different visual forms, and users were used to seeing it as a bar chart. But as we've added all the other series in, as we've looked at the time ranges that are really more realistic for the use case, the bar chart is not able to keep up. And so we've had to switch to a line chart, and that's part of this set of revisions. So just thinking about what that's going to look like and what the future might be upfront is important. The chart, again, is this tiny, tiny little piece. I would say the actual data viz where I'm developing a chart is maybe 10%. Actually, it's less than 10%. I think it's about 5% of what I do. Most of it is understanding the use case, thinking about those bigger architecture things, thinking through what the data needs to be in order to support the task. And all of these additional controls and interface things need to just be thought about in terms of that broader context. Of course, we all know this, we're looking for the minimal amount of complexity that gets the job done, but also not stinting on things when people really have a valid use case. We can't just decide not to do it because it's hard. We need to do things that actually support the case. And I think it's really important to realize that there are no general rules here. Yeah, there are good practices, there are best practices, there are guidelines, but what counts as intuitive and what counts as useful is always going to be a matter of the context, the task, and the particular person. You may have a very, very valid reason for recommending one chart type over another, but in a particular context, sometimes a donut chart works. So just a few thoughts there on some of the things that we've encountered on these different things. If you're interested in knowing more, the Data Viz Society is always a great place to look. As Christina mentioned, I am on their board now, but I used to pitch them even before. It's a great place to find other people who are interested in this stuff. Most of you probably already know it already. And if you're interested in sort of keeping up with me, I write a lot for Nightingale through the Database Society, and I'm on their Slack group a lot. So if you wanted to reach out, I'm on Twitter technically, I'm on LinkedIn technically, but I usually see things a lot faster through Slack. So happy to continue the conversation. And if this looks very exciting and you happen to be someone with good UX experience, my company is hiring a couple of UX designers right now at a sort of mid-senior level. So reach out and get in touch if you are interested in that. I'd love to talk more.
All right, thank you, Erica, so much for the presentation and for thinking more broadly and more critically about charts and the context around them. We have a couple of questions, actually. We have 15 minutes, maybe we can go through them. So somebody's asking that in your, they were saying in your screenshot from Amazon, the Amazon shopping cart, you had a book.
Yes.
And I am personally not familiar with the book, but they were asking, how does your ecosystem view relate to Munzer's evaluation hierarchy, if at all?
I found Munzer's book to be sort of transformational in how I think about data viz. That was why I put it in there. I do very highly respect her grouping of charts. I think the places that we share are a focus on the functional nature of encodings and the ways that we use the visualization infrastructure to support those tasks. I think there are differences a little bit in sort of how we approach the individual things, but I do find that to be a very, very solid reference that I enjoy a lot.
All right, thank you. Somebody's asking, what are your views on how Illustrator and Figma handle charts? Because you showed examples of both. Yeah.
My views. I have many thoughts about Illustrator versus Figma. So I'm actually right in that this chart is the first time that I am implementing something this complex in Figma as a design component to be shared in our application. We moved into Figma about 1.5 years ago. We used to use Sketch, and I have always used Illustrator for the more detailed and intense data viz stuff. I still find Illustrator to be much faster and easier because I am an expert user in it and I already know how it works. For a lot of the more custom charts, if I'm doing an exploration on my own for something, I will be an Illustrator. It's much more powerful and I can do a lot more things with it much more quickly. But Figma is much better for sharing with engineering, sharing with our team, and making simple structured components once I know what I want. But the level of shenanigans you have to go through to work with the layering structure can be really difficult. So I have built some components here. All of these charts you just saw are Figma components that I built out, but I wouldn't ask anybody but myself to go in there and edit them. So I think they have their advantages and disadvantages. I use them both. I move between them, but Illustrator much more for exploratory and Figma much more for production and repetition when I already have something that is well designed.
All right, thank you. Yeah, it's always tricky to decide on a tool, and then like every tool has its limitations, right? So you have to work around them.
Yep, they do at least share a language. At least you can import and export SVGs, though not seamlessly between the
We have another question on UX research, actually, and regarding connecting charts and tasks to a specific persona. Do you do any UX research on a case-by-case scenario, or like how do you engage the personas, and do you have any time to do this?
So I would say that we do a lot of persona work, a lot of use case requirement gathering, and a lot of general user feedback. We do a lot less usability testing, where we go in and we specifically ask someone to interact with the application, and then we watch whether they succeed or fail. That's something that we are still working toward. In fact, I have a series of 4 calls next week to sit down with some end users and look at these charts and decide if they can read them now. We'll see how they do. I think that is really important. It's something that we're always striving toward, but because we do work with external clients, we have to work with whatever is available there. So it's been a process. It's been a couple of years on this product and this project, and we have a very close partnership and collaboration with one client. So we've been able to get a fair amount of access to end users that way. but getting access across different clients and getting insight from people who aren't just typical to one particular culture has been difficult. So it's always a work in progress.
Another question on, you mentioned that you work in Illustrator and Figma. What software or programming language do you use to create these visualizations?
I do not do any code at work. So my job is specifically design. I do the mock-ups. We think about these things. I write incredibly detailed specs with all of the different logic and different combinations for the chart, so that the engineers can go in and know exactly what it is that they need to build. But I do not actually write any code myself. Our team, sorry, go ahead.
No, that was going to be the next question. Somebody asked how you actually write these specs for engineering, particularly states and transitions.
Yes. So our team uses high charts, and so they implement there. We have considered D3. There's a barrier of complexity of learning. The customization is much better. The visualization in some ways is easier than trying to work with the high chart defaults, but D3 is a more specialized tool. And for a general engineering group, that can be harder to learn. Mm-hmm. So right now we're in high charts, and it's a conversation. You know, it's a back and forth. I will write a draft. We will go through all the different logic states. So we just did all the logic for the milestone markers on that chart, and they change based on what data is coming in. They change based on a whole lot of interesting pieces, and you know, there's a lot of things that go into that logic. There are inactive states, there are disabled states, there are changing and display states that we just draw out. And that's where Figma is very helpful. If you create the component in Figma, you can easily edit the specific conditions of it and really easily make those different state diagrams. Whereas doing that in Illustrator would be a whole lot of copy and paste. So if I've made a component and structured it well, I can actually go back and edit the parent component later, broadcast that out to all of my child components, and then my spec file updates. So that's one of the primary reasons that we use Figma for that kind of stuff. So I don't know if that completely answers the question, but it's really a process of identifying what's desired, having a conversation with engineering about what that really means and if it's possible, figuring out how it matches the library that we use, and then getting as anal and nitty gritty and detail oriented as possible to identify every possible situation. So for these charts, I have 8 standard use cases that I need to design and account for. And then within each of those, we might have 12 or 15 different other situations that can come up. And so we went through and documented all of those and then thought about when does the chart fail? When do we need a new solution, and what have we missed? It's a lot of work.
Yeah, and you mentioned you work a lot with these filtering states and you know, showing different use case scenarios, and then very often you end up with cases where the filtering doesn't necessarily make sense, or it doesn't display what you think it will. Yep. And that was really tricky, right? You have to get into the interactive as quickly as possible so you can actually see how that behaves, right?
Yeah, and that's another place where we're beginning to develop engineering components for these. Instead of just using the library, extracting those out and programming them as stable components that can be put into, I guess I would call it a test harness, where there's a test page with information inside of it, and you can look at that and switch the different data types and see how the chart responds, hopefully before we put it into the app. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge effort on the part of our engineering team right now to build those and to test those and to figure that out. But I think it's going to make a huge difference in how we design and develop these in the future.
And one more question, maybe also related to context on, do you have to design charts that are mobile friendly, or things that will be consumed, let's say, largely on the phone, maybe not primarily on the phone, but largely on the phone? And if so, no. Like, do you adapt for that? Because that's always a tricky way, especially such complex things like what you work on all the time.
My previous application did have a requirement that everything be possible on the phone. And I believe we had 150 by 300 pixel area based on those phone conditions. And we had to try to fit everything into it. It was a real challenge. For these, the use case doesn't exist really for people to be doing this on their phones. It's much more a desktop application that they're using.
Okay, I think if there are no more questions, we can conclude today's meetup. Thank you, Erica, so much again for the presentation. And the slides they're already available on Erica's website, but we'll also upload them on our Dropbox and share that in the comments. Thank you again, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Erica, for accepting our invitation. It was super interesting to learn about your work and the way you think about charts and their context.
Yeah.
And yeah, we hope to see you again next time. We'll stay in touch via the meetup page, and have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And apologies again for the technology glitch.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye.